So thank you so much, Alina. That was a very helpful presentation to set the context for the rest of today. I am now going to introduce our first panel, which is really bringing together 3 practitioners who work to engage diverse communities, stakeholders in the work of addressing park inequities. Is Lark Galloway-Gilliam here? Hi, Lark. I'm pleased to introduce the first speaker on our panel, and I'll actually ask you all to come up, all 3 of you to come up, and then introduce you one by one just before your presentations. So as Lark is making her way up here, Lark is Executive Director of Community Health Councils, a health promotion and advocacy organization that focuses on improving the health of under-resourced communities through a focus on policy and environmental changes. Lark has played an active role in seeking health equity, environmental justice, and improving. Okay, sorry. Excuse me. We have more important things to do. She has improved the built environment in underserved communities. Her work challenges all key stakeholders to examine and work to undo the chronic conditions confronting communities and that produce health inequities. Lark has received her undergraduate education at UCLA and her master's here at USC, so she bridges the gap. She has published work in numerous peer-reviewed journals, and she serves on a number of national and statewide coalitions and boards, including the National REACH, Racial and Ethnic Approaches to Community Health Coalition, and she also is on the board of the California Budget Project. I've had the pleasure of working with Lark and her staff at Community Health Councils over a number of years. They do tremendous work in South LA, in the county, statewide, and nationally, and I'm very happy to have you here today, Lark, and addressing the symposium. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to apologize for some redundancy. Alina just went ahead and borrowed my presentation, so, you know, we'll work with it. We'll skip through it. So as Manal said, I am the Executive Director of Community Health Council. We are a nonprofit. I think of us as a social justice health policy organization situated in South Los Angeles, I think strategically, because we understand that the community of South Los Angeles is both, I think, the heart of LA, a wonderful place to live and work, and I do live and work in South LA, and yet the consciousness of this city in terms of challenging its values, its vision for its future, and its understanding of equity for all. CHC has grown. We have about 4 policy areas, domains, if you will. We work very closely. I mean, we really got our start working on issues of access to health care coverage. That was the issue in 1992. If you remember, then President Clinton was trying to also introduce health reform, and Hillary, and that, of course, went over really well. But nonetheless, the state of California was then forcing over 2 million women who are on, at that time it was called AFDC, it's our CalWorks now, into managed care, and the transition was one in which there was just a lot of hurting and injustices being done, and we stepped into that void and worked very hard to make sure that people were being treated appropriately and had choices. After a while we realized having health care coverage was not enough, because in communities like South Los Angeles, we were losing hospitals, we were losing doctors. So what good was an insurance card if you had to drive out of your community to try to get health care, to say nothing of the millions that were still uninsured. And so we began looking at issues sort of upstream, if you will. And our first area of focus was really around nutrition access and equity, around physical activity. And since that time, we've really expanded into the area of the domain of environmental health, and we've worked very closely with David McNeil back there with the Baldwin Hills Conservancy, and trying to shrink, if you will, the urban oil field footprint in our communities, so that people actually have places to recreate. And unfortunately, in communities like South Los Angeles, those recreation places are often adjacent on top of oil fields. Anybody remember Bernie Mac? I loved Bernie Mac's show. And he used to sit there and say, America, at the end. America, we're changing, get with it. The program has changed. And people of color, racial and ethnic communities are no longer something that can be ignored. 82% of the US population resides within urban cities. This 12% increase in population in urban America over the last 10 years versus the nation's overall increase of 9.7. So we know the urban core. We're no longer those wagon trains, sort of a homogeneous community. Things are changing and people are concentrating in our urban cores. A third of the U.S. population is non-white. And I know that's hard. A third seems low when you look around California and Los Angeles in particular, but a third of the U.S. population. 29% increase that 29% increase in racial and ethnic population over the last decade accounted for 83% of the nation's population growth. So we are what is growing America. I think this next statistic is fascinating because it really speaks to our obligation to think about the next generation. Non-white racial and ethnic populations under the age of 18 have already reached the majority status in large metropolitan areas. That's a profound statement. Get ready for them, plan for them, embrace them. Change is coming. More than a third of the U.S. racial and ethnic population live in the 100 largest metropolitan areas. This issue of park equity, this issue of equity to me, I had another slide, I revised it this morning, so I was going to talk about that for a second. Equity and access is really a very compounded statement. It is about, first, I think, proximity, physical proximity to resources. It's about the quality of those resources, and it's about the relative affordability of those resources. So when we think about equity, I think we have to think at least about those three domains. It's not enough to have this cute little parklet right here, you know, compared to having something as wonderful as the Santa Monica Mountains or the Baldwin Hills Kinihan Park. We really need to think of this in a much more three-dimensional way. As was stated earlier, you know, we've been talking about this for a while. And my first exposure to this was through Jennifer Walsh here at USC. She did, I think, one of the most important pieces that really talked about, brought that to the forefront. But that was back in 2002. What year is this now? Community Health Council, through our REACH grant, did an assessment of both the nutrition and physical activity resource environment in South LA back in, it was really like 2004, it took us a minute to get the thing published, but published an article with the aid of Dr. David Sloan here at USC in the Journal of Healthcare for Poor and Underserved Communities, where we laid out our findings around the inequities and really talked about, perhaps more than just quantifying the inequities in terms of park, we looked at the resources themselves, those issues of quality and affordability, and so it really took it to a different level, and one which I think we still need to be a part of our conversation. Then in 2006, for God's sake, I think it was Schick at the time, Schick, who did an audit of the Recreation and Community Services Department, and again showed here we don't have equal access, here we don't have equitable facilities, there were all kinds of issues. And the studies go on. City Project did a great mapping job, and then we put out a scorecard in 2008 that really ranked South Los Angeles in comparison to, we always like to pick on West Los Angeles, simply because that is probably the healthiest community in Los Angeles, and that should be at least the floor that we're all trying to achieve, right? What we know about park inequity, again, Alina went over a lot of this. Residential proximity to the park is strongly associated with physical activity and use. Over a third of the LA City residents live within, only a third, I'm sorry, live within a quarter mile of a park. Lower levels of access for racial and ethnic communities, we know that. There's greater reliance with the study that we looked at. 75% of the physical activity resources were really about public facilities, and there was not the Bally's and the LA Fitness, and those just aren't in our community. You have to, areas like South LA are like this donut. There's this hole, and then things are around them, and it's a new form of redlining we've come up with in this country. It's mind-boggling. There is a significant variance. We found a significant variance in not only the programs, but also in the quality of the facilities. I remember fighting, before I even began to do this work, I remember fighting to try to reopen the pool at Rancho Park. It had been closed, and it was a miserable summer. Couldn't get the darn thing fixed for the children in the community, and that's just not. There are about 25 state parks in LA County, and you look at this map, you can see where they are situated. I wish I was tall enough, but You see the little yellow there, Central City, below that South LA? We just don't have the parks in communities of color. And what you're seeing there is the poverty level, right? So the darker the Bay Area, the poorer the community. The darkest spots are around 40% and more poverty tracks. And we look at population density versus park access. And if you haven't taken the time, go on LA City Planning's website. They have put out this health atlas that is really wonderful. It's a little hard to post the maps. They don't make it easy. But they have a variety of maps that I think the visual display says it all. In this particular instance, where the coloring is the green coloring, of course, is parks, and the darker colors you see there are population density in the same pattern. That funny little, of course, this is Wilmington down here. You go up that, I don't know why LA is so strange, with that corridor, that's money, it's all about money. And then just above that, when the money dries up and it gets into South LA, and you can see that, again, the density. Same kind of phenomenon in Pacoima and Boyle Heights. But of course, South LA, to me, is a case study. South LA accounts for about 18% of the city's adult and 24% of the youth population, and only has 8% of the city parks. Something's wrong with that, right? So you would hope that it would be somewhat closer than those numbers would otherwise suggest. The ratio, and I think we talked about this earlier, 0.4 park acres per 1,000 versus the city of Los Angeles, which is 5.39, right? And there's a lower percentage of facilities. What we found when we went in and we looked at the hours of operation, the parks facilities themselves tend to be in South Los Angeles closed for more hours than you would see in perhaps like the West Side. And it was pretty startling. Park acres per 1,000 residents, again, you see the, it's hard to pick it out, but that lighter region right there, that's again South Los Angeles, and you can see that very high population, but less than 1 acre per 1,000 population. And why parks are important to us, I think, is just about, gets down to things around health. Health inequity, believe me, if you don't have your health, that's everything. It's an economic driver. You know, it's our ability to survive. Just really quickly, a couple numbers to sort of make the link. This is looking at adult obesity rates by health districts, unfortunately. But the South, Southeast, and Southwest, again, are South Los Angeles. And you can see we're suffering at higher rates of obesity. This is children. Now, this is a crazy thing. This, of course, we would never have the same data set. This is for community plan areas, the city's way of mapping. And again, we're looking here at childhood obesity rates. And look, at the bottom again, we're seeing this communities such as South Los Angeles, Harbor Gateway, Arleta, Pacoima, and the like. This, to me, is the most startling one, and I think we have to continue to remember this image. This is life expectancies. We have a variation of 13 years between West Los Angeles and South Los Angeles. That's just unconscionable. And again, when you think about the fact that these are communities that don't have access, it helps to understand why these charts look like this. Understanding the cause, I think Alina did a really great job talking about issues of racism, poverty, segregation. I'm not going to go through that again, but I do want to talk about overcoming park inequities. And you know, it really is about increasing open space in park poor communities. And there's lots of ways we can do that. We need to increase funding for park acquisition. We need to streamline the acquisition process and site control process. We need to provide greater incentives for the use of vacant lots. We need to provide public access. Our schools for communities like South Los Angeles, which are really old communities and pretty much built out, schools provide a wonderful opportunity. Okay, and one of the things that I'm really big on is we talk about park acquisition. We also need to make sure that there is funding for programming and maintenance so that we don't have the facilities that we do have are in fact functioning. And communities need to be a part of this process. In terms of policy opportunities, the Assembly passed a bill back in 2013. LA is now going through a review of the Quimby policy here in Los Angeles, and we're hoping there's going to be an opportunity to utilize that to break the chain on those dollars so that they can come into communities of need. This Assembly Bill 551, I think, is fascinating. It was a bill that was passed to try to create these agricultural zones and to utilize vacant lots for agriculture. We should have something like that for parks. I don't understand why not. Joint use again. We're going through our community plan updates. And then, of course, Proposition 13. We all need to understand its implication. There is funding available. We are not doing an adequate job of training and building capacity in these communities to go after this funding. I don't know how much of that is still left on the table, but we need to make sure that we have a process in place so that when these funds become available, we're in a position to grab hold of them. And I also think we need to start looking at other kinds of funding like transportation. There's a lot of money in transportation. How do we link parks and the like? I just wanted to talk a little bit about some things that we're doing. CHC has created this Open Acres website. We are going to be launching it very quickly soon. I'll make sure that we get the notice out. It is going to be a resource for the community that will identify the vacant lots, both public and private, in Los Angeles County. And we're hoping folks will take advantage of that at the local level to be able to identify who owns that lot and how do I begin to start talking to that owner about acquiring it, if nothing else, for temporary use. There's also a work we're doing in a collaboration with wonderful organizations like LA Land Trust and Trust South LA called Free Los Angeles. I didn't get it for a while, but now I get it. And now, that age, I'm telling you, got to get to that age. It is our effort to try to utilize vacant lots for a day and get the community involved in seeing how it could be transformed. And then hopefully they will go back to that website, work with those owners, and try to find ways of transforming those lots into more usable space. They're one-day pop-up events, and I think you're going to be hearing more about that in the year to come. Thank you so much. Did I make it? Okay, close. Are we staying up here? Or?
Jose Gonzalez is founder and director of Latino Outdoors. He will be sharing with us his work at Latino Outdoors and why engaging the Latino community is critical in building urban park advocates and stewards. He'll be talking to us about the connections between engaging Latinos in the outdoors and why having parks in all communities, low-income communities, communities of color, is really critical to building the next generation of park advocates and park stewards and leaders. As an experienced educator in both formal and informal educational settings, Jose is developing Latino Outdoors as a collaborative partner for organizations who are seeking to diversify their outdoor and conservation programs. He conducts trainings, workshops, and speaking engagements around topics of conservation, the outdoors, and outdoor education and environment. Jose received his Bachelor's of Art at the University of California, Davis, and his Master's of Science at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and the Environment. His teaching credential coursework was at the Bilingual Multicultural Education Department at CSU Sacramento. Jose, welcome.
Well, hello everyone. Buenos dias. Good morning. That's what we used to say, right? Good morning. So it's a pleasure and a treat to be here. Thank you, Alina, and to the just the Neighborhood Land Trust, because I've had the opportunity to be down in LA so many times. I'm not from LA. I'm from the Central Valley, born in Mexico, and I grew up in the Central Valley, and I've been in other parts of California. But every time I come down to LA, I'm running from Boyle Heights down to California Historic, the Historic Park, right? So I'm just loving the experience all this time. And so I'm here to talk about, a lot of this will, I think, hopefully stress and highlight what has already been shared. And when it comes to that question of like the importance of engaging Latinos in parks, it's almost like that question has been asked for so long, and it seems like, well, duh, or so how, or why, or what? And for me, it started in the same way. And I use this idea of cuento, and especially yo cuento, which in Spanish has, the meaning of I count, but also I tell a story. So I like that because I really get to that point of how cultural understanding and storytelling plays a big role in value, along with the data and information that we have. And we know that in environment and conservation work, data is important, information is needed. But a lot of times, you also need and in addition to, because we know that information by itself doesn't always change behaviors. Right? We know that we need to also add the social emotional aspect. And especially for culture, those connections have a lot of value that sometimes are not quantified, sometimes they're felt, they're not measured, but they have an impact. And just as when we talk about poverty and other things that, as we hear people say, well, we know it's real, but well, can you measure it? That's a separate question and issue. But so that's why I go with the idea of Yo Cuento, because Latino Outdoors started with that idea, that question. If I were to ask you, over a year ago, 2 years ago, to go on to any search engine, Google it as we say, and type in Latinos and outdoors, just those 2 words, what would come up? Who would be the individuals, who would be the organizations doing this work? Because that's what I did, and I found little to nothing. And I thought, well, everybody's talking about Latinos and engagement with conservation in the outdoors. So where are we? Where is the professional community that is here, that is growing, that has been doing this work since the 60s, 70s, before and up to now, but it doesn't have, that community building is different than when we talk about immigration, than when we talk about health, when we talk about education, and yet it's all connected, right? So a couple of things is, related to what's been shared is the demographics and storytelling value in this and why engaging the Latino community, and we'll get a little bit into just even that term itself. Why it's critical in building urban parks, advocates, and stewards, but all in LA and urban settings across the state, and of course across the nation as a whole, because this is the time to do it, and especially now that in California, how the demographics are changing, and since the 2012 election, the federal election, all of a sudden realizing that political power is there if it's engaged. And of course the questions of equity, privilege, and justice. And what does this mean in terms of the vision and future? So the first thing for the demographics and story is that some of these questions and issues, they're not new. I mean, sometimes they feel much more present nowadays. Part of that is just the environment we're in terms of social media and how everything seems a lot more in your face all the time. But when Latino Issues Forum started doing some of this work back in the late 90s, it was the same thing, that Latinos throughout the state cared about the environment, especially about parks. And yet there seemed to be a disconnect with conservation organizations in terms of saying, why aren't Latino communities, why don't they care about the environment? So why was that disconnect there? Because when the measurement came down, it was support for clean air, water, and park was clear. So it's really about how is the storytelling not coming across conservation communities and Latino communities, which is still to this day. It's not a question of if, but rather how. How is this concern and value shared, and how is a conservation community listening to and willing to be open to what are the conservation stories and values and ethics in Latino communities, just as we expect Latino communities to be open to the conservation story and ethics and values. So it's not that we have two separate, distinct, opposing stories and narratives. It's really about how are they connecting. And that's why when I said with Latino Outdoors, it was, where are the Latino-led conservation organizations? And is that needed and does that matter? And for me, it does. Because I find that sense of connection, and as I said, that sense of cultura has value that I know I get to see and experience every day when I do the work that I do. And this idea of demographic story, some of this is kind of like, of course, we know, it's obvious, Latinos reaching plurality in California this year, and then that's going to keep growing. So we know that throughout the state, LA for a long time has had a strong Latino presence. But throughout the whole state, we're seeing these changes. And that is an opportunity. It really is. It unsettles some people. It can be a question of like, what do we do? But it's really, like I said, it's an opportunity. It presents an opportunity to all work together to do this. It is not a challenge in the sense that it's a win-lose, sum-zero game. But yet, we're dealing with the narrative of what does this mean? And I put this up here because I thought it was telling how, the question was at 2013, 2014, but that line struck me. This is going to be surpassing whites for the first time, which I That's not true. That's ignoring the fact of what has been the Latino presence when the state was founded and prior to that. It would not be for the first time, right? There already was a predominant Latino, in that case, Mexican-American, Spanish, Californian population before this, right? So it's just this presumption then of, again, we're looking at what are the mainstream and cultural narratives, because that matters. When I came first to the U.S., I had a sense of history, but it's striking for me to come to California and say, why are there so many towns and streets in Spanish, right? And then later on, it's like I'm saying it one way and I'm getting corrected. It's not Vallejo, it's Vallejo. And I'm like, but that doesn't make sense to me, right? So that matters in the sense of community. And it can be a challenge, as we're saying, equity, privilege, and justice, because these can be and are uncomfortable issues and themes for a lot of people. And they can come from a sense of being defensive, of not understanding, of not being ready. But I think that it is doable. It is done. I have done it, especially when I say we engage it through storytelling. Because if I come at someone and say, hey, let's look at your privilege, that can trigger something in terms of saying, like, whoa, 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 okay, I've had this discussion. Every time I engage in this, I get attacked, or whatever comes out of it. But if we're talking about, and if I ask you, tell me, what is the Latino story in California? You still then have to look at, well, what does that mean? What are the biases? What are the assumptions? Who are the characters? What do they look like? What do they say? What do you think about them? Where did you get that story from? Who were the storytellers for that story? Who are the characters? All of that is embedded in there because it matters in the same way that if I ask you, what is the conservation story? Right? And when I talk about those stories, I think about the storybook, and then we talk about how do we want to welcome others to our storybook, but also how do we want to be part of their storybook. And that really gets more at these questions. Then we can have those conversations about privilege, equity, and justice, because they do need to be addressed. As we talked about, equity is a question of not just being equal, but about make sure that needs are met. And it doesn't mean that everybody necessarily gets the same thing, but we address the needs that are there. And that it's not about taking away what you have, but rather how, what is the underlying reason that it's different than what you have is better than I have. And if I'm asking for addressing that level of equity, why is that a problem? Why is that a problem? So Quest for Racial Equity in Parks has some worry, because it's a conversation that some are not ready to have, but it's needed. And when we come across by saying we can work together at this because it's a common issue, it helps everybody, it lets people know that it's not that I'm angry and bitter about not having what you have, but rather if we're all working together and we want to have equitable communities across the board, that it is a benefit, a public and common good benefit for the whole community, then it gets at that question about what do we really mean when we want to operate as a city, as a county, as a community. Otherwise, what you're indirectly or directly saying is we want segregation. We expect there to be inequity. So when we look at mission statements from organizations or from city charters or whatever, and says to serve the community, are you actually doing that, or are you indirectly saying to serve only this type of the community, right? And that's the challenge that we say. So look at the work that you're doing and then just put the action behind that. And we talk about park equity, because especially when we see this in other issues. So even like food, for example, right? We all want to have access to organic food, to be healthy, to have all types of food available, and then we forget at times, where does this food come from? So what is the kind of labor and hidden cost that it takes to get this kind of food? So same thing for parks. If we say we want to have public parks, you need to say, well, what does the public look like? And what do we mean about what public access looks to these parks? And then we need to be open and attuned to how these parks can be used, how they may be used differently, and don't expect one set of requirements about how parks be used. Right? So if we're going to grill corn on a grill, that's just as great as having ham and cheese sandwiches, right? And again, we can I say this because we laugh about it, but it's like it's being open to that and saying, well, I do want to know. I want to know rather than I want to prescribe. And so some of this information was already shared. It's the question of we can gather the data and information, it's there. And we have cases and we have studies, and so we need that. And this percolates down into actually on-the-ground work. This is a photo from another study in, I want to say, I think Georgia or Alabama, in which they were looking at as demographic change in a community. So as we have more Latinos coming in, what do they inherit? So maybe as the Latino community is coming into one neighborhood and another demographic moves out, do they get that same access to parks? Do they have less access to park, or does anything change? And that's exactly what was happening. They're realizing they're not getting any better access to parks. So as demographics has shifted within LA as well, you know, what's happening to the green spaces with that? And vision and future, I talk about this because, you know, here are two pretty clear examples of when we talk about the youth and young, how they see themselves engaging with open spaces, but also whether you're already, you know, you're not youth or young anymore, but now you have a connection to the outdoor and open spaces, and you connect a cultural identity to this. So I love sharing this. This is my colega from Sacramento, and he identifies as a Chicano in the wilderness. And he hikes. He didn't have a positive outdoor transformation experience as it's the prototype. He started doing this last year. Why? Because he's a teacher, and he cares about what his students do. And through that work, he got connected to this. And now he's had this positive transformation experience. And because of that cultural identity he carries, there's a whole community that rallies around him, right? Because they trust him not from, you know, being an outdoors person, but because he's an artist, he's an immigration activist, he's a poet, he's an educator, and now he's a cultural connection for a lot of other community members to access their open spaces. And so we're looking at this in other ways too, social media, so quote-unquote millennials, young Latinos who are much more diverse and inclusive with all of their communities. And if you've not seen this, this is parkstatement.com. They're trying to do a little bit of work about how social media is present in parks. So you can go on there and look up all types of different open spaces and parks throughout California and see the photos from Instagram, from Twitter, from Flickr that people are uploading and hashtagging to these open spaces. And then to close, a few things here is the health connection is there, as I already shared. And in the Central Valley, you know, I think we use this as case studies too, because it's similar to urban spaces in LA in terms of that's a natural connection. Once we get people going out on nature health walks, they'll go, as long as you address other questions of, you know, it might be culture, it might be language, it might be safety, they'll go. So I have a group of mothers that go with me to walk up and down the river because they're like, Jose, with you, we want to go. We've always wanted to go, but they don't have the being a male Latino privilege that I have. So I can use that to say, well, let's all go together because they've always wanted to go. And that's how we're accessing those parks spaces. So these are the questions that I threw out there. You know, how is Latino leadership supported in this work, and why does this matter to you? The questions of what you do know and don't know, and how you have those conversations. Because if you're not having them, you make the assumption that they don't matter, or that, well, I'm here, how come they're not coming to me? And then are you willing to put in the work? Are you willing to put in the work? And that's why I did this. I could have had a much different and comfortable job just teaching in the classroom, but I felt this was needed. And it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity, like I said. And that's why I decided to found Latino Outdoors, because I was looking for that leadership infrastructure. I wanted to see how youth, beyond just getting them into outings, how are we connecting to mentors that have done this for a long time, whether they worked in city parks, urban parks, state parks. How are we getting the whole family out there, as we're also getting the youth, also the families, and why that matters, and the storytelling, so that these stories are just as present as any that you see on Outside magazine, for example. And so we're online. So we welcome you to come, check it out, submit your stories, check out what the storytelling that we're trying to do. We're trying to do on-the-ground work in terms of city parks, state parks, open spaces, but also so that it goes up to the leadership infrastructure, so that you have a sense of connection to a community, so that we can, you know, this phrase about si se puede, pero hazlo, but it has to be done. It's got to be done. So I'll pause here because we're going to have a lot more questions. And I'm hoping everybody here knows who this is. Yes? No? Okay, so if not, this is Dolores Huerta. So if you know Cesar Chavez, then you need to know who Dolores Huerta is. But I say this because when I've presented this picture in other conferences or communities, it's important to say why she matters. Because just as much as she has been a civil rights and immigrants' rights advocate, she's also an environmental activist that I think a lot of people don't pay attention to. So, thank you so much. Out of time.
He has made a real effort to get here through LA traffic, so we welcome you, Charles Thomas Jr. He's Regional Manager of Youth Programs for the Pacific West Region National Park Service. In this role, Charles is responsible for establishing strategic youth engagement initiatives in 6 western states and 59 national parks, and managing $4 million in congressionally appointed funds to support youth outreach programs throughout the Pacific West region. Charles is a man with a long history of firsts in promoting diversity and inclusion in the outdoor world. In the early 80s, Charles was the first person of color in the history of Southern Oregon University to graduate with dual degrees in physical geography and environmental studies. While at the university, Charles fought tirelessly, that's a hard word for me to say, tirelessly with the administration to diversify its student body. Ultimately, the administration created the Minority Student Program, for which Charles became chief recruiter. Also, while at the university, Charles created Third World Union, a club for American minorities and students of color from around the world to share their common culture and experiences. During his college years, Charles approached the U.S. Forest Service and assisted in the design of a program that recruited African American students into seasonal employment positions in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in the state of Washington. Charles has worked as a naturalist for LA County Outdoors schools. He wrote the section of the staff handbook on how to work with ethnically diverse students. Later, as an ecologist for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, he was honored by the Federal Equal Employment Opportunities Commission for designing a program that introduced urban youth of color to the environment and the work of the Army Corps. Throughout his work, Charles has, his work has revolved around Outward Bound Adventures, where he worked seasonally and part-time for nearly 20 years and worked full-time as executive director there for 16 years. He has created several award-winning programs dedicated to enriching the lives of underserved urban populations, especially high-risk youth and their families, by introducing them to therapeutic value of spending time in wild places and open spaces, including our national parks. Charles has received numerous awards and recognition for his work. He has been a White House invitee, honored by his congressman, honored by the State Senate, County Board of Supervisors, Board of Education, City Council, and numerous community-based organizations. His favorite award so far has been the National Mosaic Conference Award, given to him in 2000 because it was given by a jury of his peers and the population he served. Charles continues his efforts to ensure that all youth have access and opportunity to engage in meaningful nature-based programs through his consulting work and his position with the National Park Service. Currently, he is working on a book that will assist others in designing programs that connect urban youth to nature. I'm looking forward to hearing everything you have to say, and thank you so much for joining us here today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, and it's so nice to see all these smiling faces. And you know, when you hear people read stuff off like that about you, you say, hey, are you sure that's me? You know, did I do all that stuff? But indeed it was, and I guess that I have been. I'm known for my modesty, by the way. But I guess that I have been in the game for quite a while, and I'm glad to see some new faces in the game. I see people that I recognize. I am not in uniform for a couple of reasons, because I'm sort of wearing 2 hats and dual roles here, and I'll explain that to you in a little bit. The programs I'm about to present to you are really programs that I created somewhere else and then got carried over into other agencies, but specifically now into the National Park Service. So I want to first start out by saying that I use the broader definition of green space, and I'm sure that most of you guys would agree with me, is that it includes human-created or human-generated park areas, as well as naturally occurring areas throughout wherever, or wilderness areas. So why don't I just jump right into it? I know that I have 15 minutes. You guys have been very, very patient. Let's start with some 10 fun facts. I'm not going to even say anything. Look at those facts. I saw some tongues. I saw some tongues. All right. Whenever I put together a presentation, especially with young folks, it's very, very important that they understand that this is all about fun. Okay? It's all about growth. It's all about inspiration. And it's all about fun. And for us as adults, it's all about fun. Well, some of us are adults. Some of us are a little bit, just hitting that border. But let's go right into that. So, how do we expand access? Well, let's start with what you guys already know. The very best way to expand access is remove barriers. Okay? And what are the most common barriers for keeping people away? You guys know this one. Lack of proximity to green space, like our kids in South LA. And of course, there's no historical network or context. Their uncle didn't take them out. Their grandmother didn't take them out. They didn't have agencies like MRCA getting them out. They didn't have agencies like LACC getting them out, or whoever you guys represent. Lack of knowledge. Where do we go? What do we do when we get there? And that is a really big one, okay? And I'll explain that in more detail a little bit later. The other one, lack of transportation. We might want to bump that one up a little bit. As you know, a lot of folks just don't know how to get there, but more importantly, how are they going to get there? A lot of folks, when we start talking about low-income communities of color, they just don't have the transportation network. Expenses, food, permits, and gear. That's a really, really good one, especially if you do the kind of programs and trips and stuff that I've designed over the years. Gear and permits always trip people up. We spend an inordinate amount of time training staff on how to do gear. They don't see themselves portrayed in images that promote people going out into the outdoors. I did this survey. I worked for Outward Bound National, and I did an international symposium for them, and I surveyed 27 magazines. Just looking for some skin in there, right? A little bit of color. I did find one person. It was a cartoon of a Native American, okay? But besides that, every face on those magazines outside and all that, at this time, this was 11 years ago, there were no urban people of color portrayed in that. So that is very, very important to our kids. And then there's a fear. There's a fear of discrimination. I remember talking to the founder of Outward Bound Adventures, the program that she was telling you about, and he started taking African Americans into the woods in 1959, okay? He's a former Tuskegee Airman. And I said to him, Mr. Chris, weren't you terrified not knowing what to do when you go in the woods? And he just laughed at me, and he said, you know what I was terrified of? I was terrified of people coming and getting us. And that was a real fear for him in 59, 60, all the way up to the 70s. So there's discrimination, and there's still a fear of discrimination from a lot of our kids. Just recently, we had a group of kids from a group in Santa Ana going through a preserve, and a woman, she had the temerity, she had the nerve to come up and ask the staff, do you really have a permit for your parade? Meaning that these kids didn't belong there, had a long string of kids. So there's still that kind of discrimination. Animals, yeah, bears. They're going to get you, right? At least the kids and everyone. And you can use that to your advantage when you're doing wilderness trips too. And of course, getting lost. All right. Hey, look at that. That looked good, Amy. Here's one of the programs that I created about 12 years ago in conjunction with my good friends over at MRCA too. This was a Teach Me to Camp program, and what it did, we focused on low-income, single moms, and if they had a man in their life, he was welcome to come along too. But low-income, single moms, just getting them out and teaching them how to use gear, how to get out there, how to purchase gear. So that program was really, really important. And it was really funny how that whole thing happened, because I happened to be walking through the woods with a very wealthy man, and if I said his name, most of you guys would know who he is. And he said, Charles, what do you want to do? What do you think is the best thing we can do working with these populations? I said, we need to teach the parents. We need to franchise parents so they know what the kids are going through. And he said, how much do you think it would cost? And I said, oh, probably $60,000, $70,000 for me to run a year's worth of program and do 250 families, which is really a real little bit. Nonetheless, he put out his checkbook and he wrote me a check for $80,000. Don't you all wish you had friends like that? And that's what kicked the program off. Then I went over, and later on it became funded through MRCA, a part of it, and then through the National Park Service. So we have to create programs that really start in the community, not too far from home. And I push this all the time when I do talks. The axiology of the group, and that is the science of how humans, especially different ethnic groups, how they assign value and beauty to things. You must understand the axiology as well as the epistemology, how these groups acquire knowledge. You use those two modalities and you design your programs around that. If you're going to expand access to folks like this, you have to expand people's ability to understand the value of access and what that can bring them, because some folks still don't understand that. So this is one of the families. You involve the entire family, however the participants define the family, okay? Not the regular way that everyone wants to define family. When I remember growing up, I am African American, Native American, and Japanese. And you know what kind of havoc that wreaked on me and the folks when you have to color in that little box. They didn't have other back in the day. I couldn't even do other. So I was torn between having to pick an ethnic group, So I always just, I put an NA, not epical. And so I said, you guys figure it out, okay? Anyway, let them define how their family is, because families are very different in different cultures and communities, okay? And you must guide the experience so that the participants have adequate time to bond in an outdoor setting. That's really the most important thing. Guide the experience. That doesn't mean you step in and lead it, but you guide the experience so they have time to bond. And that means a lot to families. Okay, have the staff, that's one of my former staff, cook and eat with them. Breaking bread is real big. Latino community, black community, Native American community, Hawaiian community, you better eat. You better eat with them folks. Break bread, sit at the table, show them how to use the stuff, and eat. Eat the food. That's really important. That helps to develop real meaningful relationships. If there is an adult male in the family, I historically worked with 93% of the families that I worked with didn't have an adult male in the family. However, if there is an adult male in the family, you make sure that he's active, he's involved, and he learns right alongside the children with whatever you're doing. Because from there, he's going to be inspired to go into the outdoors. He's franchised, more engagement, more ownership, a richer experience with nature, and that therein lies him getting his family out again. So here's another program I created. Don't you love, look at that mug shot. I love that guy. So I created a program called Get Out and Learn, okay? And I think every outdoor program probably has a Get Out and Learn program. I did this because, and I think all of you know, so I'm sort of singing to the choir here, that in nature it tends to build a more cohesive community faster than any real community can, neighborhood can. So what is Get Out and Learn all about? First thing we do, empower them by showing them how to control their destinies through knowledge. First thing we do, you're here, this is Watts, this is Devil's Punch Bowl. Now you tell me three things. What highways you're going to take to get to Devil's Punch Bowl, how long it's going to take you, and what direction are you traveling in. That's very empowering to young people. They can get back on their own. But there's a map activity that goes along with every program that I design where we teach the families or the kids how to get out to where we're going. That's the first tool in their toolbox. Now, this compliments, again, of MRCA. It takes real intentionality to deal with or remove disproportionality, okay? Long words just saying, there are a disproportionate amount of low-income urban kids of color, as you all know, that are not getting into the outdoors. And it takes real intentionality. And I'm going to get into the real part of the intentionality in my last few slides. This is a half an hour from their concrete existence. The kids never knew that that was there. Okay? But if you look at that group and you look at that instructor, it doesn't look like most of your average outdoor education programs. But he's just as qualified and he's doing just as good a job as anybody doing that. But this slide's about intentionality to remove disproportionality. And then the other thing is, I teach this process called Devo, right? Not the group from the 80s, Devo. Direct engagement, vigilant oversight. What does that mean? That your staff or you guys are directly involved in the process of their learning, but you're not teaching them. You're not lecturing. You're not a talking head. You are just there to directly engage and be engaged with them for connecting them to nature. And remember that their reason for not connecting to nature is far stronger than your reason to connect them. So you have to be able to overcome that. You have to provide opportunity after opportunity. And the challenge. And most kids will tell you that they hate it, that don't provide them with a physical challenge. No matter what they say, that's a key barrier. Provide them with a challenge. Then when they overcome a challenge, they begin to associate the outdoors with a personal accomplishment. Provide them with a challenge each time. That's another challenge. Then, this is another program I created called the Yaker. I think most programs have YAC, Youth Advisory Council, and I'm trying to bring that into the Park Service. Thank you. It is just growing your own. Get your staff together, grow them. Okay, grow them out of programs like that. More YAC. Now I'm going to zip through these final slides, but there's one thing I want you guys to see, which is this cultural piece. If there is an element in any way you can interpret the culture of the people, make sure that their story is told through whatever event that you're having. That's absolutely key. And work. You can see the OBA shirts. Let them know that there is value for their time if they're working on the land. That's really important. It's not just going out and picking up trash, but they're doing real work, and there's value for their time. And this is some of the members. Again, this is part of something a program that we had with, most of you guys know Joe Edmonston. Well, they were going to present before the Coastal Commission here, right, on why there was a need for camping areas. Give them a voice. Always get them involved in the politics of it. That's real important. These kids grew by leaps and bounds after they did that presentation. And then I'm going to zip through these slides. This is a new program that I just created. Now you see why I don't wear my uniform. It makes me look fat, and I just don't like it. No. Thank you. So I created something called the Diverse Outdoor Leaders Institute. And basically what it is, there's the United Nations of outdoor educators, including the LGBT community. So it is about training instructors that look like and come from the communities that these kids come from. They understand the context of these kids' lives, okay? So I'm going to zip through them. These are them going through some of the national park information, learning about the national parks so they can interpret the national parks. And as you can see, you're not going to go to certain outdoor schools and see an instructor with big tats all up and down his neck. You might find it at some places locally. But this guy turned out to be an excellent instructor. So we want to make sure that our instructors look like the kids that they're working with. Okay, and we train them, and we train them, and we train them. So they're some of the best out there in conditioning. They started out with 120 instructors. We ended up with 14. Okay? They couldn't, a lot of them couldn't make it. All right, then return home to their parks. Their work should be done in their own community. And this is them at home in one of their local parks. I think I'll wrap with how do we provide greater access for the outdoors? This is the stuff that I've just been telling you. Okay, design the programs that engage the entire family. Make sure you have culturally competent staff. Design programs that have matriculated links to other programs so that there's longitudinal engagement. The kids have to go through these serial epiphanies, right? The first time I went out, I hated it. I said I'd never go out again. But it took a series of trips before I said, this is better than jail, okay? I'll pick the out of doors. And I'm not saying that our kids are going to jail. I was the one that was quickly heading that direction. Okay, create opportunities for stewardship activities that go beyond just picking up trash. And have staff that look like, come from similar backgrounds, right? And grow your own staff and leadership from within your organization. Provide transportation, absolutely, and expose the participants to a variety of outdoor learning experiences. If you take those 8 things, then you've got the start of a very good program. And then to conclude, I won't suppose that you can't read, but I'm going to read. To connect an inner city child to nature, don't attempt to remove the inner city. That's the worst thing I've seen some organizations do. They want the kid to behave a certain way. Of course, you have to have the kid you have to have a standard of behavior. But if you have an instructor that doesn't understand the culture from which that kid is coming from, and they're saying, hey, don't call each other fool, and that's how the kids are relating to each other. Our dog, hey, why are you calling him a dog? He's not a dog, you know. When they're saying, hey, dog, what's going on? You know, don't try to remove that from them. Just increase the child's ability to see what nature is all about. This young man right here I was with this morning. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit behind schedule. This morning I sent 12 kids off for an 8-day High Sierra backpacking trip. That's Rogelio, and his dad was a gangbanger, and he was a gangbanger. And today he was heading out on his 3rd 8-day backpacking trip. And I said, Rogelio, hey man, why do you keep coming back? And his answer was what we all need to know. Because you asked me. So ask them and keep asking them and get them out. Thanks for my 20 minutes.
So now I would like to invite Lark and Jose back up to the panel to be joined, to join Charles. And thank you again. I think a nice round of applause for all 3 of our excellent speakers. Will be in order.
I'd like you to address the historical use of land, our methane. Lark knows this, the oil fields, the methane emissions. I'm missing that part, especially in inner city, because that's what we have here in LA, is oil fields. Where you can address that the inner city can start getting engaged with the natural part of it, including animals, in with the urban part of it.
So I do think the point was made earlier that there's a distinction between sort of the natural habitats in which issues such as water conservation and the like are perhaps more dominant. And this push to create parkland in environments in which we don't have those natural resources, we've lost that. The opportunities to restore that, I mean, I think you see that in places like the wetlands that they did over on, what is it, Avalon and 54th. I think a lot of what, particularly for communities of color, you have to appreciate from my vantage point is, we're on a trajectory. You know, we're at the very fundamental starting gate of just saying, we want space. We want to be able to go out. We want to learn about nature. We want to, you know, we've been sort of locked out of that experience and are faced with so many challenges that these issues, a lot of the environmental issues are just now coming to the forefront. And I think it's just a matter of time in which you'll start seeing the convergence of these larger sort of global environmental issues in urban planning and urban parks started merging together, but we're talking about the basics of just even having a little piece of, you know, a little parklet next door to somebody. And I think that's the tension that you're trying to express right now. We're just not there yet, but I don't doubt that we will, given the drought and given all the concerns around the environment, that will have to be a growing and central part of the conversation of how do we increase access to open space in urban settings.
One is like this question also comes up, you know, how do we get urban communities to care about like national monument designation up in the California coast, for example? Like, why does that matter in terms of just preserving wilderness or the like? And then the second, you know, we're talking about ecosystem services like marshes. I think, you know, for me, I agree. And in addition to, it's almost like as an English language learner, when you say just because you don't know the language, it's assumed you're not competent or intelligent. So I take that from the classroom. So a lot of times it is about connecting the language, because I've had those conversations with families and with mothers. You know, we can have a conversation about the value of wetlands and riparian ecosystems, but first we need to get them out there so they could see this is the difference in terms of having a riparian ecosystem versus the channelized river that you have. And then we can have those conversations. But it's just that those primary connections are at times missing, or they just look so different, especially if they're recent immigrants, than what they're coming from, versus what might be missing if they're like second or third generation because they grew up in the city. So I don't think it's like necessarily this chasm or schism, but rather it's like, I think it's just about keep making more of those connections.
It seems that we're moving towards concrete with no trees or greenery, but open space that you can walk and exercise. And I guess my question is, when you're trying to create open space, is all open space created equal, or as community members should we be advocating for mixtures of open space?
And I do think it's about language. I think it's about getting communities to understand the level of expectation we need to increase that. And so that we are demanding and expecting more. I think the more that we have children and families out in more of a natural habitat and they begin to understand what the possibilities are, hopefully our expectations will increase, because we shouldn't just have a little, it shouldn't be just like this tablecloth. That's not what it's about. And we've been working to just try to get trees put back in South Los Angeles, much less in the parks themselves. And I think we need to start training and educating and give people the language to know what it is that I want. I don't want just that green grass. I want, and begin to design those elements and create standards by which we all enjoy the same type of resources. And I think that it really speaks to an issue of equity. Because you wouldn't see some of the parks that we get in our community, you wouldn't see that in other areas. It just wouldn't be tolerated. And I think we just need to learn we need to raise the bar.
A lot of times, young folks, especially urban folks, they don't have a understanding, or open space doesn't have an identity for them. And to get back to what you said, is all open space created equal? It can be, but it depends on the impact it's having on the intended beneficiary, so the kid. So where one kid may consider just a regular urban park, deep wilderness, another kid may consider it exceptionally, mundane, and I don't want to be here, I want to be somewhere else. But it depends on it. But one thing that we know that is true is that getting a kid outdoors is really, really important, and outdoors aside from, the major concrete and urban areas. So I don't think all open space is equal, not at all. It depends on how the response from the young people or the families.
And I wrote with one quick statement. We took it was a 3-year-old, I think, and we got to begin this riparian park. A lot of oaks. I mean, it's very different than a city park. And first thing that he says, so where's the park? Right? Because he's used to a city park. And so, but once we went through, like, this is just another type of park. Like, it wasn't a question of, like, I don't believe you. It was just, oh. So.
The organization and its situation is one thing, but when we start seeing communities' assets being threatened, you've got to figure out ways of getting that community involved. What's the value to that community of this space, and they need to be the champions, the stewards for that effort.
In March, I was at the groundbreaking ceremony for Los Angeles State Park in Chinatown. It's not being developed and built. And one of the state leaders who came down for the ceremony said that there's money sitting in Sacramento right now that's earmarked for parks in Los Angeles that is just sitting there unused because Los Angeles has poor leadership. So I'm just curious what that means to you.
This is a city that loves to, we're bankrupt, right? We're always on the verge of bankruptcy. So, but I would be curious to find out what specifically he was referencing and why that's sitting there. I mean, that's part of the work of engagement. We as a community need to be active about ensuring that we maximize the resources that are available at the state, federal, and local level to develop these plans. So, you need to push him on that one.
There's all these different groups doing a lot of great things, the Sierra Club, everybody reaching out to these different groups. I'm wondering if there's any advantage to having kind of a league, a network, where I'm hearing more about different groups but I don't know if they're talking to each other, conversing, or having, you know, ultimate summits where they go to a place or actually network these ideas, or at least the coalition that could become from that. And I was wondering if there's any thoughts on how you would handle that.
So yes, the short answer is yes, because it's almost cliche when we go to a lot of these conferences, and it's like, oh look, I'm one of 5, right? And that's my impetus for this. And now, same thing, the challenge is starting really small, because it's the question of everybody's saying, oh, well, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, but then who does it? Like, who walks the walk, so to speak? So I'm putting myself out there in that risk, because I could, like I told you, I could have been doing something else, working for one of these organizations. But, so yes, so I talked to Rue, for example, talked to Marlene. It's that idea of how are we connecting and supporting each other, and that's where I'm trying to remove myself more and more from direct programming. I mean, as Latino Outdoors, we're still doing direct programming through a volunteer base. Like, that's how I tell them, I can't pay you. So how can we work together so that it benefits you as a leader? Because that's what we need. And that's what I tell people. There's power in community and being able to have these, we call them convenings, gatherings, where we can be doing this, because a group like this is rare. If I look at this audience, it looks very different than other conferences that I've attended. And that's credit to the community here and to the Land Trust, even when we visit, you know, other conferences in the same way. You have to remember that the power that is in having something like this. The answer is yes, we are talking to each other, but there's a bigger need in reaching out. And so it's a start, but it is being done, I want to say that.
So the question for people who might not have been able to hear in the back was about safety at the parks, around the parks, and when safety is a barrier to participating in parks that may be there.
You know, I know there is a safety issue. I just hate that it is the story that gets told about our parks, because you know, it's rare. And but at the end of the day, like anything else, I think it's about, does this community feel connected to this park? Does this community own this park? Has an effort been made to really take back the park in a way that, has the park been designed in a way that it supports, you know, a more sort of all eyes on the parks kind of orientation? Is there active programming that's happening at the park? I think, you know, we've got to flip that switch around, that story about safety, and realize it really is about connecting people to their open space and having that be an integral part of a community. And then I think this conversation around safety just sort of, it's not the story.
I think it's about franchising folks and running your program in there. And actually the dangerous element, or the safety issue, it's about getting them, because I worked on a project which was an urban park where it kept getting tagged, and finally I just caught the taggers and I hired them, and the tagging went away. So it's about engage. I know you may have a safety issue much larger than tagging, but it's about franchising the elements that are causing the problem, you know, some way, shape, or form.
The Summer Nights Light program does a great job of making the parks a place where people want to be. And of course, that's an investment on the part of the city to actually put programming in the park. But there are a lot of people who are, you know, I had a great shot of folks who were just up in the Baldwin Hills Park and did a boot camp on Saturday mornings. They're just taking over the park. You know, they just own it. And that's what we have to encourage.